Um, so I know that we have some varying levels of experience with lobbying and with working with your members of Congress. So I'm just going to get started quickly at the basics. So the first thing we like to do is sort of go over a few of the myths about when people think about what lobbying is. So the first thing that we like to talk about is what lobbying is not. So what lobbying is not, at least for us, it happens in other ways, with other organizations. But for us, it's not people coming into a smoky back room with big bags of money and paying off politicians and secretive backroom deals. So you can see here, this is what, when it comes to mind, when you haven't had any experience with this type of work, the types of things you think about: Wall Street, big oil, big arms companies, that type of thing. But what we're doing is not that at all. We're having meetings with our members of Congress as their constituents, and we're advocating for the things we believe in. And they are generally very receptive and listening to that, because at the end of the day, money and things like that do matter, but the thing that matters to them the most is their votes and how they got there and responding to their constituents. So that's the power that we bring as grassroots advocates. And so that's just sort of a way to set the stage that we always like to do with people. So what is lobbying? The way that we do it is, and the way that it is for everyone, is that it's seeking to influence a politician or public official on an issue. So for today, obviously we're talking about climate change, but you can use it to talk about any issues that you care about. And a great thing about this training is that we're doing it about climate change today, but you can use this same sort of model to talk about any issue you care about with your local legislator, whether it's a congressman, a senator, or city council, school board, anything, any level of government. It's also basic democracy in action. So when we think about democracy, people usually just think about voting or volunteering on a campaign. But what happens once we get those politicians into office is probably even more important. And so we think about lobbying as a fundamental aspect of being active citizens in a democracy. And it's also, the way we do it is, it's about money versus people. So money does have an undoubtable influence in our politics, but people are also very powerful. And so what we do is we try to amplify the power of people and activism. So how do you influence your lawmakers? Where do you have a conversation? So of course you want to go in with facts. So you want to, have done your research, know what you're talking about, give them facts. Myths are things, things that maybe if your lawmaker is not someone who you agree with, things that they might throw at you. And values. This is the most important one. So facts and myths are, they're obviously, it's important to know the factual information you're talking about, but the way that we do our lobbying and what we've found to be most effective is not going into an office and just quoting a lot of facts that you've read. It's really talking about your values, why you care about it, and why it matters to your community. So this is another good way to think about it. So when we do lobbying, we're bringing in our networks of people, and you can see this sort of in the visualization: family, staff, business associates, other associations you have with your friends, with your church, whatever it may be. And so you can think about that with lobbying as well. What sort of network can you tap into to improve the power that you have to bring more people into this process? So how do we take that and have a respectful and effective conversation? Regardless of whether we agree with our legislator or not, it's really important to come to the table from a place of respect and from a place of trying to find common ground with them. Because as I said, your legislator has their opinions. Hopefully they agree with you. But if they don't, going in there and talking about a lot of facts that you found about why that lawmaker, why that staff person is wrong, that's really not going to persuade them. what might persuade them, what might get them thinking about things differently and the way that you want them to think about it, is finding the common ground with them. So the way that we like to always start out our meetings, and I'll go over this a little bit later as well, is with a thank you. So it can be something as simple as, holding an event in your community if there's not other like bigger policy or legislation that they have done that you've agreed with recently. But it's always good to start by, and that also just shows that you care, you follow what they've been doing, even if you don't necessarily agree with it. Finding a way to connect with that legislator or with that staff person you're meeting with is really important and really sets the stage and kind of opens them up to listening to you. And so finding common ground, facts are important as well. It's good to have a few. It's definitely good to sort of like know the basic facts about what we're talking about. So with climate change, you want to have done a bit of reading. I'm sure most of you, if you're on this call, you already really care about this issue a lot. So you probably don't need to worry about this. But just in general, you want to know some facts, some information, but really the most important thing is your personal story. So why do you care about this issue? What effect does it have on your life, on the people you care about, on their lives? And so the goal with all of this is building a relationship with that office, because if you are trying to change their opinion, if you are trying to influence them in some way, that's not going to happen with one meeting, right? So it's really important to come in and find that common ground with them, and then build this relationship that you can build up over time to the point where you're a trusted person. They trust your opinions in your community. And that's when we find the real influence can happen. So how to prepare for your lobby visit. The first thing you want to do is do your research. So you want to know what your representative's position is on the issue. You want to know their voting history on the issue, maybe some biographical information. This is a way that when I'm doing lobby trainings, we have a lot of school groups come into FCNL, and when I'm doing trainings with them, what I like to do is make a little biography page just to pass out to the students so they can see some things about their lawmaker. And this is a great way to find things that you can have common ground with. So, if they are from your same church, or maybe they're from your same hometown, things like that. There's a lot of information you can find just by doing some quick searches online that can really help you sort of get a more personal feel for the person you're meeting with. Also, key issues are really good. So maybe they don't necessarily agree with you on climate change or environmental issues, but maybe you agree with them on another key issue, and you can use that as your thank you. So that brings us right in, finding a thank you. So you can use all that information for finding your thank you. And then it's helpful if you can to schedule a meeting in advance. Offices will be able to probably talk to you for a few minutes if you come in unannounced. But if you want to get a good longer meeting, you always want to schedule in advance. You can always find the information about the DC office as well as all the district offices on your legislators' websites if you just go online. And they generally are very receptive, especially to their own constituents. So just send them an email, give them a call, they'll set up a meeting with you. And oftentimes, since you are going to be lobbying your actual lawmakers, you will be able to actually meet with them and not just their staff. So ask them to call the office, ask them if you can set up a meeting with your lawmakers. A great time to try to do this is on recess. So we have a congressional recess coming up over the next 2 weeks. And that's when most, if not all, members of Congress go back home to the district. So it's a prime time to be able to get a meeting with them, because a lot of what they do over recess times, and they happen every month. There's a longer one in the summer as well. But a big part of their job during recess is to meet with constituents. So it's a perfect time. So that's a great timing on this training as well. And then you want to practice what you're going to talk about and how the meeting's going to go ahead of time. And we're going to go through how to do that. And then the materials I send you as well will help you practice. So what we're talking about today, before we get into the nitty-gritty of how the actual meeting goes, I just want to give a little bit of context of the topic we're talking about. So what we've been doing a lot of work on at FCNL is the concept of carbon pricing. It's also called a carbon fee or a carbon tax. You usually see it being called carbon fees or carbon pricing because taxes are a very loaded word here in Washington, and we want to avoid that, and legislators especially want to avoid talking about creating new taxes. So carbon pricing, carbon fee, carbon tax, it's all the same concept. But this has been an issue that has been slowly building up the bipartisan support that we think is really important to getting things passed. So a few highlights from that. Last summer, he was a former representative from Florida, Carlos Curbelo. He introduced the Market Choice Act. And this was the first major climate legislation introduced by a Republican member in a decade. So it was a big deal. He wanted to show that it wasn't just Democrats working on this issue, and he made it Republican only. So only Republicans could co-sponsor. So the Market Choice Act, it was a carbon tax bill. It was a carbon price. It placed a price on carbon, and then it used that money to, one, the trade-off with the carbon price was it swapped the carbon price with a rollback of the gas tax. And then it also rolled back some of the EPA's authority to regulate the types of substances that produce the carbon pollution that was going to be taxed. So that was sort of the trade-off. And then it used the revenue that was going to be raised on a variety of different things. What we liked about it was that it used the revenue on infrastructure, especially on sustainable infrastructure that is resilient to climate impacts. So things, like building highways that can withstand major storms, things like that. It also set aside some money to assist people who are making a lower income level, because one of our main concerns in FCNL is if we're going to be doing a carbon price, we need to really make sure that that carbon price is not impacting the lowest income communities for a few reasons. The first reason is that there's a lot of studies and economists have shown that people who are lower income spend a higher percentage of their wealth on energy costs. And it kind of makes sense. If you make more money, a higher percentage of the money you have is going to be spent on things like gas, electricity, etc. So when you introduce a tax, just basic economics is going to tell you that the price of those things are going to be raised, and a portion of that raised tax is going to be passed on to the consumer. So we want to make sure that a Republican or any carbon tax is not going to be regressive and hit those people the hardest. So that was something that we liked about that bill. And the second reason is that there's actually a lot of research coming out that poor people, people of color, people from marginalized communities, they are already actually being impacted the most by climate change. So there was a study that I read recently that was really interesting that showed that when big storms happen and floods happen, the people who are hurt the most by that are lower income people living in urban areas that don't have access to a lot of the resources that higher income people have to sort of adapt and deal with things like major flooding. So those are two of the big things that we sort of evaluate carbon pricing bills by. And we actually released principles as this kind of started to become a more popular topic in Congress. We released principles about how we evaluate carbon pricing. So I'll send that out in an email afterwards. But it's a good way to think about it. And it's how we think about how we evaluate our support of all the different bills that are coming out. Then last Congress as well, there was a bipartisan carbon pricing bill. So this bill was, in this Congress, it's only co-sponsored by one Republican, Francis Rooney. He also co-sponsored last Congress. Last Congress, it was also co-sponsored by Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, who's also a Republican, and it has a pretty large number of Democratic co-sponsors at this point. So it's a similar idea in that it raises a tax on carbon emissions, and it's taxed at the point of extraction. So the initial tax goes onto, the oil companies, the energy companies, et cetera. But the way that it differs from the Market Choice Act is that instead of taking the money and investing it into infrastructure, into low-income assistance, and into a variety of other things, it actually just takes that money, puts it into a fund, and then just divides it up evenly across all US citizens and residents of the US. So, and lawful residents, I should say. So we have some concerns about that as well. There are concerns about how that dividend is actually going to be delivered to everyone. We just want to make sure that the money is going to everyone that it should be going to. And also, when you encounter issues of people who may not be fully documented immigrants in this country, how are they going to see the benefits of that? Because they are often going to be paying the higher prices of energy. So this bill has been gaining some momentum, and it's been really positive with both of these to see that we have been building up bipartisan support. There's also going to be some more bills coming out soon. We recently had, it wasn't a carbon price as much, but it was a similar sort of concept. Representative Beyer introduced a carbon cap and dividend bill. So that's it's similar to the cap and trade concept where the government sells permits for certain amounts of pollution. But rather than having a trading mechanism, they actually sell the permits, and then that auction, they take the money, and like the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, it goes into a fund and it's given back out to the American people as a dividend. And then the theory of that type of thing, those types of bills, is that the number of permits gradually goes down. So you try to ensure that emissions are slowly going down, depending on how quickly you ramp that down. So we're going to be seeing a variety of different bills. There's going to be even more in the works. We've heard here about a carbon pricing bill that would use the money to lower the payroll tax. And there's probably even more that we haven't heard about yet. So it's a really exciting time to be working on this issue. And we are really excited with all the bills and just trying to build up support. FCNL, we have not endorsed one specific bill. We are more working on just building up support for the concept of carbon pricing generally. And we've seen a lot of progress on that front. So we're really happy about that, and we're really looking forward to how this moves and builds up energy this Congress. So this is the ask we're going to be talking about today. So I will send this as well as a PDF that you can print out and bring. And this is actually a great thing you can bring if you're going to be having a meeting on carbon pricing. You can bring this and say, this is what we're asking you to do. This is what you're asking you to consider. And it has some information, so you don't have to, have these statistics off the top of your head. I know that can be difficult. There's so many different pieces of information, especially on this issue, that can get super technical. So this is just a little leave behind. It's just one sheet of paper that I'll send to you. And it sort of communicates our language about how it's our moral obligation to protect vulnerable communities and seriously address climate change and work in a bipartisan fashion. And that carbon pricing is one of the many important policy tools that Congress should use to reduce emissions. At FCNL, we don't think that a carbon pricing can be enough on its own. And I don't think many people who are serious about working on climate change think that either. But we see it as an important sort of tool in the toolbox of the variety of things we need to be doing to transition to a new economy, get us off of fossil fuels, and restore our environment. So we can just go through, I'll just go through this really quickly. Some of the reasons why and what we expect from a carbon pricing bill. One of the reasons why we think it's an important part is that a lot of economists agree that carbon pricing is a cost-effective and efficient way to reduce carbon emissions at a rapid speed. And it was also mentioned in, as it says at the top, the biggest sort of international climate report from the biggest international climate authority of scientists said explicitly that carbon prices are a necessary condition of ambitious climate policies. So at the minimum that we are looking for from all carbon bills is that it should be high enough to reduce emissions at a scale that scales with the goals that we set out in the Paris Climate Agreement. Ideally, we'd like it to go even farther than that. But that is sort of the baseline that we're looking for. And then if reduction targets are not being met, if the price is not functioning as the economists and the people who had modeled it thought it would, there should be a mechanism within that bill to increase the price to sort of catch back up to where we should be. As I was talking about before, we need to make sure that the costs of this carbon price are not borne by marginalized and low-income communities. We need to also make sure that polluters are not going to just move their operations to other countries. So there needs to be a mechanism in the bill to provide for that. There's things like border adjustment taxes, where if you move your manufacturing, extraction, things like that to other countries, it's going to be taxed higher to counteract that. And it should also, we need to make sure that we have frequent reporting, we have transparency to measure these emissions to make sure the bill is working like it should be working. So that's just a little bit of background. This stuff can get very complicated and technical, but I will send you our principles, and if you're interested in learning more, there's a lot of information about these different bills. There's a lot of economic studies you can find for free online. So I encourage you, if you're interested, to dive into that. But like I said, it's not as important that you are an expert on the minutia of these super technical things about how the tax is levied and things like that. It's more important to talk about why you care about this, why you believe that this is a solution that would matter to your community. So this is how we like to structure our lobby meetings. This is also going to be sent out to everyone in a nice worksheet. So you will be able to actually just write in, there's blanks for you to write in different things. And so you can bring that with you to your meeting and have it as just a reference for you, so you don't have to keep everything in your head. So the first thing you want to do, if you're going with a group, we like to divide up some of the roles. So you want to make sure that you have someone who's going to be the group leader. The group leader is just the person who introduces the group, usually has the ask sheet to hand to the staffer or the legislator, and just sort of gets the meeting started. Usually the group leader, if we're going into doing the thank you, it's an easy way to do that. So you, as I was talking about, you want to find something that you appreciate about their work, thank them for that. And then the group leader, the way that we really introduce it is the ask. So the ask is the reason why we're there. So in this case, it's support a carbon pricing bill in Congress. So you would say that, so introduce yourself, say your thank you, and then say, and we're here to ask your member, if it's a staff or the legislator themselves, to support a carbon pricing bill in Congress. And so then this is when we get to the most important part of the meeting, and the thing that we've found to be the most effective, and that's the stories. So depending on how many people, if you're just going on your own, you can just tell a story about yourself. We usually find if you have a larger group, that 2 or 3 different stories, depending on how much time you have with the staff or the legislator, that's usually good. We try to keep the stories to about 1 to 2 minutes. Another good thing, I'll rewind slightly. Another good thing that you want to do in the introduction is to ask how much time you have for the meeting. So then you kind of have a sense of how long you can go, if you have to maybe not tell as many stories, things like that. So you want to get started on the stories, and you also want to have someone taking notes. So you don't necessarily have to take notes on the people's stories, but you want to have someone write stuff down if they have responses in the middle, things like that. And then especially when you get up into the follow-up questions and more of a conversation, just make sure that you have someone designated to take notes, because one of the things that's really important about the work you do is that it goes into report back forms, and then we actually get to see it so we can follow up with the DC offices, and that really helps us. A lot of the meetings that we have, we ask offices, what's the biggest thing that we could do to sort of help your member, help your boss care about this issue, want to work on this, and almost every time they say, we need to hear from our constituents. And that goes from Democrats who are supportive of climate legislation to conservative Republicans who have not had a history of being supportive. They all say, we need to hear that our constituents care about this. And so when you do this work, it really helps our work as well. And so when you're going into the stories, this is a thing that you want to have prepared a little bit ahead of time. But like I was saying, the things that you really want to think about is how it's affecting you, how it's affecting your family, your friends, your community. You can have facts in there, sure. That's, it's important to ground everything we're talking about in a factual evidence basis. But the most important thing is your personal story. So it can be things like, for example, for me, what I like to talk about is I was raised in Northern California. And about a year and a half ago, the big fires that happened up in Northern California burned down a lot of the houses of my friends from high school. They got within 10 miles of my house. And I remember, it was a really scary time to be calling. I was in college in Los Angeles at the time, calling back up home to my dad, saying, how's it looking? How are the winds looking? Are we going to have to evacuate? And then just a few months ago, only less than 2 years after the fires happened, we had 100-year rainfall, and a big part of my town got flooded. So some people literally who survived these fires, lost a lot in the fires, had their small businesses flooded by this huge flood that we had. And we know that both of these things, things like the extended drought we've had in California, the higher temperatures contribute to fires, and then climate change, changing weather patterns contributes to having more severe rainfalls, more severe flooding issues. And obviously, we've seen all of these things going on across the country with the hurricanes, the flooding we've had in the Midwest recently, you name it, it's all connected. So you can say something like about that. You can talk about, your local community, if you have issues with environmental degradation in your community, whatever you really comes to mind first, whatever resonates with you the most. So you want to go through those, share why they matter to you, share why. I think also an important thing to remember is to keep in mind that you really want to tie your story into why you're here and asking about what you're asking about. So if you're talking about, in my case, about dealing with extreme weather, how does that connect back to what we're talking about? So you could say something about how, obviously, if we're wanting to mitigate these extreme weather impacts that we're seeing, we need to reduce our emissions. And so that's why we're here asking you to support a carbon pricing bill, because we need to take bold action at the federal level to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So you want to try to incorporate the ask really as much as you can throughout the stories. The next thing, so like I said, depending on how much time you have, it's a good idea if you have enough people to do 2 or 3 of these. And then the staffer or the member of Congress is probably going to ask you some questions. They probably will ask you sometimes some more general questions. Sometimes you have to try to guide the conversation back to the topic that you're here to talk about. Sometimes we find that members are more interested in trying to ask you general questions and not actually talk about the issue because they don't want to try, say something that they don't want to commit to things. They don't want to give you too much information, especially if this happens more frequently if your member doesn't agree with you about this stuff. So just try to keep in mind, sometimes you have to try to steer the conversation back in the right direction. But that's okay, and they understand that you're here to advocate for something. So if you just change the topic and say, answer the question they ask and then say, but we're really here to talk about this, that's perfectly fine. Just, remember to be respectful at all times, of course. And so you want to have a conversation. At this point, you can also ask questions of them, what are they working on the climate change issue? If they have a favorite type of solution, what that might be, things like that. And then you want to, the group leader will probably wrap up the meeting once. So, you can have a conversation for as long as the time you're allowed. And then the group leader will want to repeat the ask, just sort of to wrap up the meeting and say, thank you for meeting with us. We really appreciate it. We just want to reiterate that we're here asking you to support a carbon pricing bill. And then it's super important to remember to ask how you can follow up with that office. So usually that will be an email. They'll probably give you a business card, but you definitely want to follow up with them, even if it's just to thank them. If you bring up certain things, sometimes when we have meetings, we'll bring up certain information we've been talking about. So you can send them things on email. You could send them, for example, if you're talking about carbon pricing, you could say, I'm working with the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and they have these principles for how they're evaluating carbon pricing bills. So I can send that to you if you're interested. And we usually find that staffers and members are pretty interested, especially staffers are pretty interested in learning more about things. So that's a good way to build up that relationship, and it shows that you are prepared, and that when you follow up, then you can say, we really appreciated this meeting. Here's some follow-up from our discussion, and we'd love to meet again. And that helps you get in the door again for your next meeting, and to build up that relationship over time. And the important thing to remember too is to go online, and I'll send a link to this as well, and fill out the lobby report back form. So the follow-up with us is just as important, really helps our work. So just remember to do that as well. And so these are just some cool pictures that we have we do a lot of groups, school groups. So it's really fun to bring young kids here. I've personally, since I started in September, had I think 5 or 6 different groups of young people come in, and they selected themselves to talk about climate change. And so it's been really awesome to see their passion, and we have had some of our most productive meetings following up on the work that they did. So it's a really great way, and this really kind of drives home the importance of what you all are doing, the importance to our work, and the importance of how it really does make your legislator think about these issues and want to work on them. So that's the training that I have for everyone. We have some time if you'd like to ask questions. You can just unmute yourself and ask questions, and I can answer them for the next few minutes.
Hi, this is Bill Sweet.
Hi, Bill.
My congressman has neighborhood office hours. Once a month, he sends a staffer out. He has quite a few. He runs down from the northeastern corner of San Antonio, 200 miles south to the Rio Grande. I've met 4 times with one staffer or another. How common is that kind of thing, that kind of arrangement for representatives or senators, for that matter?
Do you mean having multiple offices?
Having having neighborhood office hours. I mean, one is in the neighboring town. We share a border at a city uh, government building. The public library in my town. They're 5 miles apart, maybe, but he has them in all kinds of little towns, all the way down the
Interesting.
150, 200 miles, once a month. Um,
Yeah.
Last time we went, the staffer said, greeted me by name without um, my introducing myself. Uh, Obviously, I've made enough of an impression, whatever. But is that kind of thing useful? The first time I went to downtown San Antonio, paid for parking and all that kind of stuff. And but it's much easier to go 2 miles to the library and talk to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely a good way to get a meeting. I think how often or how common it is to have those types of things really varies widely on based on your member of Congress. Some are a lot better at having things like office hours and town halls than others, and um, I think that's a when you have meetings and show that you're really passionate and knowledgeable about these issues, that sort of encourages them to get more involved with their community when you have those positive interactions with them. Um, but I don't know if I could tell you how common those types of events are across the country, because it really varies a whole lot. Some members have almost no sort of community events, and that I know that was a big issue in the election. A lot of people were lost their elections, and a lot of analysts were saying that partially the reason was because their constituents were getting pretty mad at them for not having things like town halls where they could talk about issues. So it really does vary widely, but obviously, the more that they are involved in their community, the better. But regardless of how many sort of public forums they're having, they all have, depending on, the size of the district, at least one or two district offices with dedicated staff who work on constituent services. So they will have people there to meet with you. Oh, sure. All right.
I have a question. I'm in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. There is a tremendous amount of pipeline development for gas and disturbing a lot of farms, just degrading the environment. And so this is an issue that is related to capping carbon emissions and so on, but it's not directly related to the issues that you used as an example. And I'll just say additionally, we are an extremely gerrymandered state, as you probably are aware.
Right.
And I'm also engaged in just trying to support fair districting, which I think is an environmental issue because
Yeah.
The party leadership has a very strong influence on the senators and representatives in office in terms of dictating their policies and their voting patterns, and so that can be daunting because one
Yeah,
can show up with the facts, with stories, even receive some apparent understanding and support, and then in the voting, that's at times it can happen just as the leadership has instructed.
Yeah, definitely. I think, all of these kind of issues tie together. The issue of pipelines, I think that's definitely something you can talk about. It's not, like a direct impact of climate change, but it's infrastructure for things that are making the issue worse. So if the issue that's really impacting you is pipeline development, I think absolutely you can talk about that. And that in some ways is even more effective because it's a hyper local thing that's happening in your community. When you talk about the big things that I was talking about, things like severe storms, that type of thing, that's a big global general issue. But when you can say, you know, I'm having a pipeline built right in my town and it's affecting us in, you know, X, Y, and Z way, I think that's a really good way to bring it home to their district and your community. So I would say absolutely talk about that. And then you can just connect it to, you know, we shouldn't be building more fossil fuel infrastructure when we know we need to get ourselves off of these fossil fuels that are creating so much emissions and creating all these other problems.
Milo?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Milo, this is Bob Schultz in New Hampshire.
Hi, Bob.
And hi, I want to compliment you on a terrific presentation,
Oh,
pacing, and in all kind of ways. Three things occurred to me growing out of my own experience in lobby visits, which I'll mention very quickly. One is, as part of the initial introduction, I found it worthwhile to get the staffer, supposing it's a staffer, to say just a little bit about themselves. Like, you know, are you from our state? Are you from our town? That kind of thing. Where'd you go to college? It puts the conversation a little bit more on a par. The second thing is, I think it might be worth stressing the difference between a constituent and a paid lobbyist. The work that you do out of the FCNL office is extraordinarily valuable and important. But I think just to remind people that that you are getting paid for that work, and constituents often get themselves to a meeting on their own, and there might be transportation costs and so on. And for the reason that you stated very well, they care about constituents because they're the ones that vote them into office. One other little thing that has created some humor sometimes, which I think is helpful. If there are 5 or 6 or 7 people in a group and I'm the leader, one of the things to be concerned about is people who go on and on at length and haven't practiced their presentation to make it short. So I often start with myself and I hand my wristwatch to the person on my left and I say, you stop me if I go over 1 minute or 1 minute and a half. And then the watch gets passed around the circle. And there's some levity about that, but there's also a sense that we're paying attention to the precious gift of time. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely good things to keep in mind. The offices definitely recognize the difference between lobbyists and just constituent activists. So you can highlight that in your meeting and say, you know, I'm not getting paid to do this. I just care about this issue in my community. And so I came here, took time out of my day, and, you know, appreciate you meeting with me. And this is why I care about this. And definitely, that's why we like to emphasize, to your third point, practicing beforehand. Definitely want to try to keep the stories brief because you often don't have a ton of time in the meeting. And so, you know, practicing beforehand is really important. That way you can sort of get your thoughts down and make them concise. So you're ready to go in and give a good, well thought out, well organized story. So I think those are all good points. Thanks for that. We had one question in the chat. I can just read it out to everyone quickly.
I can speak to it too. This is Diane.
Oh, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I'm a corporate communications executive. So I've worked in corporations and have done a lot of work in communications. So I've worked with a lot of government affairs people, and so I haven't done a lot of personal lobbying myself, but I come kind of from the communications piece of things, and when I read this, it made a lot of sense to me. So I wanted to kind of raise it and get your feedback on it. Because everything is so divisive right now. And, you know, if you have a Democrat who is your congressperson, then it might be a little easier to have this conversation. If you have a Republican that is your congressperson, I just sometimes any talk about climate change just raises a red flag. Some of them just are still deniers. So I found this kind of helpful. I found it in Quaker Earth Prayer Witness in a pamphlet they have about communicating about climate change.
Mhm.
They say when discussing with conservatives, avoid talking about the potential future effects of climate change. Instead, focus on past glories as a positive standard that is disappearing in the present, mostly due to climate change. One could describe the abundant forests, clean lakes, and rivers of the past. The obvious comparison with the present makes the case for climate change. And presenting climate change as a dire prediction of the future proved much less effective with conservatives. So it just might be an easier, like a way to approach the conversation with conservatives that doesn't put their back up right away. And they also said saying that there was less traffic in the past was more effective than predicting more traffic in the future. It's a way to connect with them and have them relate to what you're talking about in an easier way. So it's
Yeah,
very common.
definitely. I
I'd
think
love to like hear anyone's feedback on that. Like if your experience is that is true. Like if there's any, I don't know, it just made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, no, that does make sense to me too. And I think it is good, especially with more conservative members who don't have a history of working a lot on this issue. I think you're right, especially the first part. Obviously, we all know that the future impacts that are being modeled right now are extremely scary. It's a lot of the reason why we're motivated to do this work. But I think especially with members of Congress who have not displayed much interest, much motivation to work on this, or have maybe even, been actively working against progress on this issue. I think the most important thing is you can talk about how things were in the past and compare them to the present. And I think that's important. And I also think another thing is, how is it affecting us now? We're seeing so many impacts right now. And we're seeing scientists say that climate change is affecting these things. So I think that is the way that we find to be most effective, is talking about, we might not, the farmers in the Midwest might not be seeing sea level rise or, coral bleaching or whatever, but we are seeing, these floods, and there's already been a lot of issues with, extreme temperatures affecting crop yields, things like that. So I think trying to tie it into the really hyper local things that are happening in your community, and showing how climate change is affecting us right now. And it's not some problem that we can wait around and just, continue to study or continue to talk about, or just do some funding for, like R&D, things like that, because we need to be working on it right now. So I think that's definitely a good point. It's a good way to think about it. And just in general, especially with conservatives, but really with every member, I think the best way to go about it is talking about how it's impacting their congressional district, their state, their city, whatever the case may be.
Hi, Milo. This is Bill Cousins in Philadelphia.
Hi, Bill.
How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. I wanted to just amplify on one of the points that you made that I've found helpful in lobby visits. Sometimes, and it's tempting to sort of try to ad lib an answer, even if you're not sure what the facts of the situation are. And I've found it's useful to be able to say, oh, well, I'm not sure the answer on that question. It's pretty technical, but I'll get one of our experts from FCNL to get back to you with an answer. And then that can be part of our follow-up to connect with you and with Emily and other staff there in Washington to get an answer to a question. Maybe it's some technical aspect of one of the bills that the staff person or the congressperson is interested in. And we don't have the answer, but you guys may have the answer or would have the resources to find an answer that we could provide to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely a good idea, and we're always happy to help you with follow-up. But definitely, I think that, you know, to be an activist, to get involved in this issue and make a difference, you don't have to know all the super highly technical things, especially with this issue. It involves a lot of really high-level technical science that even, you know, people like Emily and I who work on this every day don't understand the really technical climate science that, you know, PhDs are doing. So I think that, yeah, talk about your personal story. And if you get questions that are too technical and too specific to answer, I think it's definitely a good idea to connect them with us, and just say, you know, we can follow up on this and send you some resources that I have been reading, but I don't have these specific numbers off the top of my head.
And that's also a good basis for us to be perceived as someone who's helpful and able to help them in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
I had a question about when you gave the example of the climate, the carbon pricing, or the carbon fees, and some of the bills that are currently out there, and one of them, the trade-offs that we're making, like one of them was around loosening EPA regulations. And I guess, you know, one area where I always get confused with climate is that, you know, just trying to like look at it, it's so big and such a giant elephant. How do you piece it apart, and what's more important than other things, and how do you prioritize? So I guess when you look at things like, you know, loosening EPA regulations, I guess that, how do they, do you, like, are there experts, like scientists, looking at it to say like, well, are the trade-offs we're making here too big? And does that make sense? Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, definitely. And so part of the reason that we have not, as an organization, endorsed any of these bills, and we're still working on this issue more generally, is that we are concerned about the regulatory rollbacks. The theory behind it is that the EPA would not need to be regulating these things on the basis of their emissions when the market is already doing that regulation for you in the form of being taxed.
That sounds like trickle down economics.
It's definitely a free market theory. There is economic studies that support that theory, but you know, there is also concern that if the tax is not working the way that it has been modeled, then there's the issue of when does the EPA get to come back in. So for example, in the carbon fee and dividend bill, the Energy Innovation Act, it would be a 10-year period where if the goals of emission reductions are not being met, then the EPA has authority to come back in and regulate those oil, coal, things like that. But it's definitely an important point to raise, and it's something that we are definitely, it's part of our concern with these bills, and it's also sort of something that was added in as a trade-off to try to appeal to a broad support base in Congress. And it's one of the things that, to try to make the bill bipartisan, rolling back regulations is a popular you know, thing for more conservative members to want. So in the interest of making those kind of deals, making those trades, that's one of the things that they've done in order to do that.
Thank you. That was really helpful. And the whole presentation, I should say, just thank you, because this has been, this is very helpful.
Great. Yeah, I'm glad that you enjoyed it, and I'll definitely send everyone all the materials that you'll need. And if anyone has other questions, I have plenty of time to answer more. But if you also would like to email me as well, my email is just milo@fcnl.org, and I'll be sending you all emails after this. So feel free to reach out to me anytime as well.
Thank you very much. This was very well paced and a lot of very useful information, and I'm glad to have all the follow-up that you're going to be sending.
Awesome.
There was a question or a comment about being local, which was one of the issues that I had when I was lobbying. The fourth National Climate Assessment, put together by a number of agencies of this government, talks about local areas. Specifically, it's written in a rather non-technical language,
Yeah.
and was really helpful for me. Excuse me, along with a article from the journal Science, to very particular, what are the impacts in my congressional district for people who, for the future, which is, again, like you were talking about, is sometimes a problem talking to some individuals, but for what I emphasize is people who are living today will be affected. My granddaughters, who are under 3, should be expected to live to about 2100 when these effects are going to be occurring. These are your current constituents. This is not the future. This is current people. But the fourth National Climate Assessment for localized information there's other stuff out there, but that's pretty readily accessible and readable. It is a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have found that to be really helpful as well, the National Climate Assessment. And I can actually put it in the follow-up email, but I worked with some other religious advocacy organizations that we work with here in DC, and we created just 1-page long summaries of each region. There's 10 regions that the climate assessment talks about and how climate change is impacting those 10 regions. So I can send you all that as well if you just want some highlights of, because the report can be long, it's not technical, but there's a wealth of information there. It's all online if you want to look at it more deeply. But I can also send our summaries just so you can look up your region and see some of those big impacts that are going to be happening. And I included some of the graphs that I thought were especially helpful as well. So definitely there's a ton of information out there about the current and future and past impacts in your local area, and there's just more information coming out every day. So all of that is a great resource to use in your lobbying. I think that's a really good point.
Milo, this is Bill again. I had another question. Has FCNL taken a position on the resolution dealing with the Green New Deal?
No, so we have not endorsed the resolution for a couple different reasons. The first and biggest reason is that the resolution itself is not an actual piece of legislation. It's more of a goals document. So we obviously, we support a lot of the goals that they're talking about. We've seen how it's really changed the conversation here. It's really raised the energy, and it's great to see so many people getting active in this issue. There's been so much more energy and so much more conversation just over the past few months. And I think a lot of the credit of that goes to the activists and members of Congress who are supporting that. Just our general policy with endorsing bills is that we would have to see, the actual bill text before we think about taking a organizational stance on it. And something like the Green New Deal, it's designed to be not a specific policy, but a statement of we need to raise our ambition. We need to raise our sights on this issue because we've waited too long. All the science is telling us that it's going to have catastrophic consequences if we don't do anything. And so we support all of that, and we love that the energy has really changed around here. But the way that the Green New Deal, when it becomes actual legislation, there's so many different goals in it. It's probably going to be a lot of different pieces of legislation. So we're just going to have to look at those as they come. If you think, about the original New Deal, it wasn't just one bill. It was a series of lots of different things that happened over time. So that's probably the way that it's going to happen again. And we will just have to look at each bill and see if it fits into our work. And so what we've been doing is talking about how things like you might see in the media, sort of things that I, find a little bit frustrating with the media, especially with this stuff, is that things are always set up as one or the other, right? So it's like, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says Green New Deal, X person says carbon tax, or, innovation, whatever. They can all work together. When we talk about supporting carbon pricing, that can be a component of the Green New Deal, or whatever our big, bold climate agenda ends up being called. It's going to need a lot of different things. It's going to need some sort of emissions reductions, whether it's a carbon tax or a cap and trade, things like that. It's going to need a ton of money invested in infrastructure, into research, so many different things. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that we need to do a lot of different things. And what FCNL has been working on for a long time, and what we continue to work on, is how do we work together with the landscape that we have right now, where we have a divided government, we have an administration that is not interested in pushing really any sort of climate agenda that is positive. What are the things that we can do now to lay a foundation for the big things we can do later? And one of those big things is carbon pricing, and some of the other things we've been working on and talking about getting involved in. Obviously Congress is still pretty new. They've only been around for a few months, so most people are still getting their feet under them in terms of actual bills. But things, like infrastructure resiliency, energy efficiency, energy storage, things like that are all important components. They don't get as big of a headline as the Green New Deal, and obviously they're not going to solve all of our problems, but it's those little things that we can do today to get us ready for the tomorrow that will come eventually, when we're ready to move forward and pass a big policy package.
This is Diane. I'm from Westchester, PA, so I'm actually right between Ann in Lancaster and Bill in Philadelphia. I'm very new to Friends. I started attending meetings for worship in the fall, and I just recently discovered FCNL. So I was curious about just when you were saying when the Green New Deal when you start seeing pieces of the Green New Deal come out in legislation, does FCNL, like, now that I think I've signed up, I'm getting some emails from you, so I'm curious if you often reach out to people who signed up for emails from you to maybe call your local congressperson to support something. I mean, I'm pretty active anyway, so I was just curious about process, if that's something that you regularly would communicate and ask us to take action on.
Yeah, so just in general, we do a lot of different action alerts. Obviously, we work on a really wide range of different issues and policy areas. But we do have, we will send out things like an action alert saying, write a letter to the editor, or write a letter to your member of Congress, go lobby, things like that. So we do definitely send out a lot of resources for that. I also write a newsletter that comes out once a month called Inside the Greenhouse, that just talks about the work that we do and the biggest news stories. And each one of those includes an action that you can take for that month. So we've done a variety of different things, but it'll have a link to the resource on our website, whether it's a template to write a letter to the editor, or organize a lobby meeting. But, obviously, if you want to go beyond that, we are always more than happy, and we always encourage as much lobbying as you're able to do. And one of the new things that I've actually been working on recently is I've been calling people who have been involved with us in the past. We've identified 8 or 9 key congressional districts around the country. A lot of members, Republican members on the select committee, and then some of the ranking members of important committees like energy and commerce, science, space and technology, things like that. And I've been calling people and, saying, thank you for your work with FCNL. Could you get involved again? Your member is really important to our work, and your lobbying would really help that. So we do a lot of work with our network of Quakers. We have staff who work on that full time, and that it's really integral to all of the work that we're able to do here is everything that you all do across the country. So.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone else have any other questions before we finish up?
Milo, you might mention the sustainability workshop that Emily is doing this evening, if people aren't aware of that.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to plug that before we end. I mentioned it briefly. There's more information online if you go to fcnl.org/events. But it's going to be a really interesting event. She's going to be having a panel of 3 different activists talking about their Quaker faith and their work on climate issues. So that's today, 6:30, right? Yeah, 6:30 to 8. It will also be put up on Facebook live stream, so you can find it there. But it should be a really interesting event. We have people from different perspectives. One of them is a really young person. She's a teenager who actually was she took a vow of silence to protest against climate change. So she just recently broke that. So it's definitely going to be really interesting to hear what she has to say. We have a person who works in the Office of Earth Care Witness in the Quaker organization on climate issues. And then we also have someone who actually used to work with us at FCNL and now works at the Citizens Climate Lobby on climate change issues. They do a lot of work actually on the carbon price and carbon fee and dividend bill that we talked a little bit about. But he's also from the Quaker tradition, so he has a lot of insights into how those go together. So definitely going to be a really interesting event, and we are excited to have it. There will be some time for question and answer and everything like that as well. So if you have some time this evening, 6:30, definitely find us online, and if you're in the DC area, come by for sure. And we can send. I'll have the follow-up email. I can send a quick link to that so you can find that easier, but it's just right on our website as well.
I'd like to point out that not everybody is on the East Coast, that it's 5:30 Central.
Yes, yeah, 5:30 Central, 6:30 Eastern time. So.
And Mountain, Alaska, Pacific time as well. Okay.
And I wonder if it'd be possible to also share information about the organizations, particularly the Citizens Climate Lobby. It's an organization that I personally have been working with since 2013, and I think that friends generally find it's very compatible with our approach. So I hope you'll share that link when you share the other information.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we do a lot of work with Citizens Climate Lobby, and the event page has bios of each member of the panel and the work that they do. So that's definitely in there.
Great. Thank you, Milo. I'm going to have to sign off now, but really appreciate the session. It was a good refresher and great information. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining. This is a great session. Thank you for all your